to today's Wednesday lunch here at the Divinity School. I'm Karen Wide. I'm the Director of Communications here at our Organizing Series. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to our first lunch of the quarter. I want to do our usual housekeeping. Our chef, Rachel, is probably hiding from me, but our chef, Rachel, and our crew made this entire meal from scratch today for you. So thank you. We do ask that you clean up after yourselves. We did the cooking. On your way out, throw away your garbage, put your silverware in our soapy bags. If possible, you can bring your glass and your mug and just put it on the back table. That's helpful too. And of course, if you could turn off any noise on your person. That's a good time to be on our show too. Very quickly, are there any community announcements today?
Yeah. Oh, we're doing it now, not at the end. Okay. I'm Anne Marie Thompson. I'm the coordinator for Open Space, our weekly gathering on Tuesdays for shared reflection and contemplation in Bond Chapel. Our theme for the quarter is What Do or Will You Remember? It's inspired by the poem Remember by Joy Harjo. So come Tuesdays at noon to hear speakers offer a personal reflection on that theme and stay for coffee, tea, and bagels.
A week from today, there is a Reinhold Niebuhr 101 at Disciples Divinity House. So if you don't know who or what Reinhold Niebuhr is, you are the target audience for this event. It's on the DSA calendar.
Tomorrow night, go to the 4 to 8, and then at 7 o'clock, go to 106. We're going to be watching the old version of the movie Silence that was made in 1971. So it has subtitles in English.
Anyone else? Okay. Well, I just want to remind you that today is the first lunch, but we have more lunches coming up. So there's some posters on your table about some upcoming lunches. Sign up in advance. Look on our website for other lunches, and come to any or all of them. They're all open to all of you. So I just want to be really brief, and I want to introduce our Dean Richard A. Rosengarten, who's going to introduce our speakers for today. The Dean's Forum with Professor Lindner. Right there. But I'm going to let Dean Rosengarten. Okay. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to exit left.
I've turned off all noise on my person except my voice. I'm not the whole Dean's Forum. Reverend Lindner, would you come up here, please? I could just see the alarm on everyone's face. Oh my God, not another address from the Dean. So these are quarterly events, as many of you know, which are the purpose of which is really to model for us a form of conversation which focuses on a published work by a member of our faculty and responses from two other colleagues about it. And the idea is to suggest that work that is written and published has both a kind of focus to it and a kind of general relevance to the life of the school. And so to that end, today we are going to discuss the Reverend Cynthia Lindner's book, Varieties of Gifts, Multiplicity, and the Well-Lived Pastoral Life. And we will enjoy, in relation to that, responses by Professors Christian Wedemeyer and Professor Willemien Otten. The format is this. Professor Wedemeyer and Professor Otten will offer some remarks. Professor Lindner will have the chance to respond to their remarks, and then we'll open up the floor for question. I've told each of them that they get up to 10 minutes. If you want to turn your phones on and time them, and you can do that, but they seem to me to be well-regulated people. So without further ado, and without taking more of their precious time, I want to welcome all of you, and I want to say thanks in advance to my colleagues, and especially congratulations to Reverend Lindner on producing a fascinating book. So, Professor Wedemeyer, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. You can also just tell me to shut up if I go on too long. Time. So, yeah, first of all, I'd like to thank Dean Rosengarten and Reverend Lindner for the opportunity to join this group today. And I apologize for dashing in as the cavalry here at the last minute. It's been a busy couple of days. I think this is probably the last, or near the last, of the Dean's Fora that have been hosted in the 12 years that Professor Rosengarten has been Dean of the Divinity School. And I thank him for a wonderful 12 years, and hopefully this will be going out with a bang, not a whimper. At least we have the backup troops here on the other side. So also want to thank Reverend Lindner for including me in a variety of different ways in the work that she does. Including me in recent years in the ministry program, on the ministry committee, and I've had the pleasure of having many of the wonderful students on the MGift program in my courses, which has really been enlarging and enriching my own pedagogy and my teaching through learning. It's a wonderful big tent that we have in the Divinity School. So reading the book, I've taken some strength and solace from the book itself as I prepared. Like her minister interlocutors, I think I felt myself utterly unprepared, incapable on occasion of what I was called upon to do, thinking that it was someone else's job that I was being called to do, and that perhaps I needed some flexibility and multiple-mindedness in stepping into this role to which I have been called by no less transcendental figure than Dean Rosengarten. My multiple-mindedness to reinterpret the notion of calling and vocation. That's theology in practice. So I may be getting ahead of myself probably, and alluding to ideas in the book that haven't yet been aired here. But certainly the idea that I might be called to a task for which I felt entirely unprepared, but nonetheless able to draw strength and orientation for insofar as I may be able to flexibly inhabit multiple roles was consoling in my own thinking. So what is the book? I don't have a lot of time. The background of the book, just briefly, was a call for grants about well-lived pastoral lives. And so Reverend Lindner rose to this call in crafting an agenda which would involve a protocol that involved open-ended interviews with a variety of people who had lived pastoral lives, ministers and chaplains and so on, and asking them in a series of open-ended conversations that evolved over 2 phases, including a self-reflective phase in which some of the chapters of the book were vetted and discussed with some of the interviewees as well. So a kind of self-reinforcing process of reflection and synthesis of the ideas. And these interviews then with a range of different ministers, of some nearing retirement, some quite young, different geographical locations, different sub-vocations within the field of ministry and so on, to try to tease out not only the specificity and the multiplicity of what these lives could be, but what are the commonalities, and what commonalities would allow, of those commonalities, which of those commonalities would allow one to determine them to have been well-lived. There was an autobiographical element to it. As I understood, she asked in the course of these open-ended conversations to reflect on their own lives as volumes and different events as different chapters. And so there's a subtending kind of literary sensibility to it that I think is a feature. And I didn't actually write it out, but if I have time, I'll maybe raise some questions in which that may have been a bug as well. But that was how things proceeded. And then she transcribed them and synthesized them and came up with some results. So the results of Lindner's synthesis is the suggestion that the most successful ministers demonstrate an awareness and engagement, if tacit, with what contemporary psychology calls multiple-mindedness. What I would describe as an awareness of the socially constructed nature of selfhood, as well as the concomitant multiplicity of role functions to which people adapt in ongoing processes of socialization. as well as the ongoing conversation, living together in her terms, as well as talking together, between self and community that sustained a well-adapted practice of living, said multiple-mindedness. So both the multiple-mindedness structures and the ongoing adaptations that sustain that and reinforce it. The chapters explore the meta-conversations that Lindner conducted with colleagues, indicating common challenges faced in vocations of ministry in the challenging times faced by mainline churches in the U.S. The experiences related are then interpreted as various articulations of the overarching theme of multiple-mindedness. That multiple-mindedness is essentially inescapable in the contemporary situation, and thus embrace and leveraging of this fact yields the most healthy and beneficial responses and outcomes. One of the most interesting examples in the book is found on page 56. So I'll just briefly read this. The context of this interview was a young pastor, or at some point he was young, but in the story he's talking about young enough to have both his father and his grandfather at the table with him. His grandfather coming from a fundamentalist background and being a strict literalist interpretator, and his father being a more complicated person who came more accidentally to ministry and was engaged in process theology. And they're fighting. The grandfather has come to live in the house and they're not getting along very well. So he says, one day at breakfast, we're sitting there with Grandpa. The son, meanwhile, is coming into ministry, but from a rather even more skeptical approach to things. We're sitting there with Grandpa, and I was teasing him about the Bible. Grandpa took the Bible really seriously, of course, and so I'm talking back. You really believe that? I can't believe that anybody would believe that. How can you believe that? My grandpa gets so angry that he stands up and says, I can't take this anymore. He walks to the door and says, I'm leaving and I am never coming back. As he is walking to the door, my father calls to him and says, Dad, does love ever fail? Grandpa believes in the literal scriptures, so when 1 Corinthians 13 says love never fails, it says it, and Grandpa obeys it. Grandpa stood there at the door for a long time. Then he turned back and he walked in and sat down. He stayed with the family, and he and my father's relationship improved. Grandpa was given copies of Barclay's commentaries and the Interpreter's Bible, and Grandpa grew in his old age. There's reconciliation and redemption right there. Or maybe, I'm not sure, there's reconciliation and redemption right there. So this is an interesting example of multiple-mindedness for me, where it seems to operate on several levels and differently in separate persons simultaneously. The three persons involved existed in a microcosm of the state of our contemporary communities of faith, living in a pluralistic world, rubbing elbows with those who have disparate worldviews, vehicles of meaning-making, values, and dispositions. This precipitated a crisis. The resolution was remarkable. The father did not adopt the fundamentalism of the grandfather, but he was able to articulate his own position in an idiom familiar to his neighbor. Nor did the grandfather surrender his own cherished positions whole cloth or unreflectively. Rather, he seems to have taken this as an opportunity to engage in his own engaged theological reflection, in which he evolved and adapted and thrived. In many ways, like this, though this is my favorite, the narratives that emerge from Lindner's interviews appear as both models of and models for how, in the microcosm as in the macrocosm, successful, compassionate, meaningful being with others can take place in the fallen, challenging world of religious plurality. In this and many other instances, I found Lindner's invocation of the socio-psychology of multiple-mindedness illuminating and provocative in the best of senses. Some questions and challenges for further reflection. About 2/3 of the way through, Lindner prophylactically raises an issue that had been troubling me as her analysis proceeded. She cites the adage that to those with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. That is, analogically, is multiple-mindedness really what is at stake in all these instances of successful adaptation and interpersonal and social negotiation? Or is it seeming ubiquity and epiphenomenon of Lindner's own concern with the psychodynamics of ministerial mental health? Or is what she is describing in the vocabulary of multiple-mindedness just mindful, attentive adaptiveness? After all, the overarching theme is the challenges to mainline ministry in a postmodern pluralistic environment to which Christian institutions, and to some extent persons, are finding themselves poorly adapted. Observe her comment on page 137 that, quote, "There is no such thing as business as usual in congregational ministry these days," unquote. In such a situation, it is not surprising that ability to flexibly adapt would be advantageous. What is at stake then in redescribing it as multiple-mindedness? What is gained by this vocabulary, particularly when some of the practical aspects of it involve not psychodynamic redescription of the self, but practical engagement with diverse aspects of the world, developing new friendships, engaging in musical, dance classes, crafts, and so on, musical instruments, and the like. The multiple challenges to inherited patterns of self, institution, and social norms are among the foremost characteristics of modernity. Tradition, in the static sense of the way we've always done things, or the people we've always been, is no longer able to function as an assumed background to the choices faced by communities in confronting their worlds. So perhaps what Lindner is describing is just that those persons who are best adapted to the conditions of modernity or postmodernity in their personal and social psychology are also, perhaps not surprisingly, those best adapted to serve as leaders and counselors for groups confronting these same conditions. One other way of describing these changes, alternate vocabulary, might be through a more conventional vocabulary of courage. Recall Kennedy's similarly anecdotal profiles in courage. The ability to adapt and the openness to do so requires substantial courage. The surrender of the self, or the current self, the one that frequently wants to be right in any situation of plurality or conflict, that surrender that seems implicit in much of the talk of multiple selves in the book requires courage. In many of these anecdotes, stability or self-consistency appears as a refuge for the weak, a false refuge which, though it may be a temporary palliative, is not able to engage root causes rather than symptoms. Both options, flexibility, adaptation, and stability, consistency, are options within tradition. That is, in a sense, one thing that traditions do and are dynamic repertoires of such choices. For stability can also be a type of courage, and even a wise one at times. Where then is the criterion? Lindner seems to defer to private internal conversations to determine this, though she is also cognizant of the public conversations in which these negotiations of tradition take place. What is the relationship in both these contexts between adaptability and standing firm, between courage and hard-headedness? Where is the criterion of tradition in a plural, multiple-minded world? Love, but love requires wisdom, as wisdom, it seems, requires love. Which relates to another question or challenge I have about audience and method. The book is pitched to practicing ministers, that is, it is a model for. But it also claims to be a new, acute description of the life of ministry, that is, a model of. The approach is anecdotal, which is almost by definition the counterpoint of a scientific approach. Insofar as science involves not hard and fast rules, but rational checks on interpretative license. To what extent is this book and its conclusions predicated on a systematic suspicion and evaluation of its own processes of inference? To what extent can this book, though it never claims to be, serve as a model of ministry more broadly rather than an aspiring how-to book? It is cast to an audience of embattled, underfunded, anxious mainstream Christians. How might this speak to the broader audience of ministry? The growing number of our MDivs, for instance, who self-identify as Buddhist, Muslim, or other. This is where I had a similar methodological question about the literariness of how these conversations took place. I mean, you mentioned Ekin and Ekin's work on the self in autobiography, and in self-consciously, deliberately casting the questions in terms of how would one literarily, narratively cast and interpret one's own life to oneself and other. There's a real question to which, to my mind, in which some of the commonalities and structures that arise would in fact the epiphenomena of how we conventionally talk about selves and lives in ministry. So for instance, the commonality that people feel unprepared for the job and that it should be someone else's job. It's not me. I'm not really called to do it. This is also a phenomenon we see in politics. Right? One is conventionally expected to not want to run for an office, right? And so to what extent is that experience of ministry, oh, it's not me, it can't be me, someone else is better than me, likewise a kind of literary discursive product rather than perhaps some deep structure of ministerial life, if that's a valid dichotomy. Anyway, whatever the answers to these questions, I found reading the book and thinking about its narratives enlarging. The praxis of ministry, which, like all human situation, is precisely practical, that is always already laden with overdetermined fields of possible meaning-making, to provide rich resources for thinking through religion as a lived social endeavor. I found it enlarging to think through this. The book is a thoughtful call for ongoing reflection on vocation, and not just ministry as a vocation, and on the practice of theology embedded in daily praxis. So I again thank Reverend Lindner for the opportunity and the challenge to engage with this wonderful work of engaged scholarship.
My thanks also to Jean Rosengarten and Professor Lindner for the invitation that I gladly accepted. And let's begin with full disclosure. I am what is known as a PK. I think everybody knows what it means. But it means I grew up in the ministry. I had a dynamic, totally happy childhood. That was totally fun, and I'm the oldest of 6, and 3 of us ended up in theology. All women, also, I should say. There's only one minister, and that's not me. That's my sister. It was a fun time, even if I was also aware at times of the momentousness of the office. So, with that background, it's not surprising perhaps that I've always seen the value of ministry, even in secular times. And in reflecting about this and thinking about the brouhaha surrounding a recent column in these August polls, claiming that universities used to be all about teaching theology, we miss, I think, the perspective that at least for our modern university, and I taught for years at Utrecht University in the Netherlands, which was founded in 1636, the same year Harvard was founded, for our modern universities, teaching theology was not primarily an academic business, but it was deeply geared towards ministry. A theology school, a school of divinity, would train ministers. That was its core business. Ministry then, I think, secures, that would be my way of putting it, that your feet are in the mud. I actually have one of these UChicago columns that I have trouble finding this morning, but it's on the History of Christianity page. And I do say there that I like the fact that we pursue the academic study of religion in tandem with the professional training in ministry. My father had a friend who may have had a religious background a long time ago, but he was a psychiatrist and he was head of a psychiatric institution. And when they would get together, and as a teenager, I would love to sit in on those conversations, and they would have drinks and they would smoke too much for anybody's good. But when it was deep at night, he would say to my dad, he would say that he really thought a good number of his patients should actually be referred to a pastor. We live in a time in today's society, I think, that makes us either somatize or psychologize the various ills that occur in our lives. And I think ministry is unique in that it's somehow able to keep those dimensions together. So the strength of the ministry individually is to keep body and soul together, but more collectively, I think the strength of the ministry is its rootedness in the fabric of society, which I think no academic field, say in humanities or social sciences, can easily claim to do. So the Divinity School here too is a professional school that has a similarity with the law school, with the medical school. Today, I would say even with the business school. And I've sometimes said it to colleagues informally. I think the Div School is to the humanities what the business school is to the social sciences. We have an enormous potential for outreach that I think we would not have if we would just be a department of religious studies. And I come from a department actually of religious studies where I taught in Santa Barbara, but it's not comparable really in its centrality, say, in some ways to the university here, and its potential for outreach. And I think of that as a value that in recent years in divinity schools around the nation and internationally even, a value that has been undersold. So, of course, with this background, I've always enjoyed teaching at a divinity school. And I personally feel that the study of religion is being enriched by devoting attention to the training of ministers of whatever denomination or whatever religion, given the more interreligious course now that the MDiv program supports. That is also true for me as a scholar who's not ordained and has never aspired to ordination. Although Cynthia knows I really like preaching. So I've always enjoyed also teaching in the MDiv program with Cynthia especially, and with a teaching pastor and an array of brilliant student assistants. The preaching and worship class was my favorite, and I must sing the praises of good preaching at this point, for which of course I'll turn to Emerson. In his famous Divinity School address, he has a great depiction of a preacher who hasn't quite mastered the task. So he says, I quote, "Whenever the pulpit is usurped by a formalist, then is the worshipper defrauded and disconsolate. We shrink as soon as the prayers begin, which do not uplift, but smite and offend us. We are fain to wrap our cloaks about us and secure as best we can a solitude that hears not. I once heard a preacher who sorely tempted me to say I would go to church no more. Men go, thought I, where they are wont to go, else had no soul entered the temple in the afternoon. A snowstorm was falling around us. The snowstorm was real, the preacher merely spectral, and the eye felt the sad contrast in looking at him, and then out of the window behind him into the beautiful meteor of the snow. He had lived in vain. He had no one word intimating that he had laughed or wept, was married or in love, had been commended or cheated or chagrined. If he had ever lived and acted, we were none the wiser for it. The capital secret of his profession, namely to convert life into truth, he had not learned. Not one fact in all his experience had he yet imported into his doctrine." End of quote. I think this is one of the best description of bad preaching. I have been able, I've cultivated that growing up to get this sense of solitude and not hearing anything of a sermon. But it's not. So the reality, what I like especially, I'm working on nature, the reality of nature and the mere spectral character of the fake preacher who cannot convert life into truth. I think that's really a great phrase. To stay with Emerson for a moment, he holds up Christianity for its historical defects, of which he lists two in the Divinity School address. One, a dwelling on the historical Jesus, an exaggeration of the personal, the positive, the ritual, and not enough attention, what he says, to the soul. And the second is that men have come to speak of the revelation as somewhat long ago given and done, as if God were dead. That's the second. And of course he holds also up two advantages of historical Christianity. One is preaching, the sermon as the frank speech of man in the singular to man in the plural, which is, I think, really interesting. But, and after that, so the second defect, he says, is that men have come to speak of the revelation as somewhat long ago given and done, as if God were dead. After which Emerson continues, another great phrase, the injury to faith throttles the preacher, and the goodliest of institutions becomes an uncertain and inarticulate voice. Just just as Emerson is widely misread, I think, he indeed left the Unitarian ministry, but not, it seems, Christianity. So I think we can, but should not, misread Cynthia Lindner in her book Varieties of Gifts by seeing her notion of multiplicity as somehow a cop-out, as if she is, and in general, one needs to be resigned to a broken and fragmented notion of church or religious community, increasingly marginalized in a secular world. Rather, as she puts it in what I see as some kind of Emersonian vein, on page 15 of her preface, she says, but all of us, clergy and laity alike, have stories to tell and multiplicities to mine, and all our testimonies are needed in a world that is dying for some good news, followed by a haunting Habakkuk quote. I'll come back to that. What the book then tries to do, in my opinion, and I'm glad my colleague Christian went through the individual chapters at some length, and what I see as its strength is to bring out the deeply dialogical, what Cynthia mostly calls relational, nature of ministry, and the complexity, multi-layeredness of what it means to be a priest, a prophet, and a pastor. And it does so by telling stories, or rather by letting pastors tell their story. That is a positive choice, namely to break away, as she also says, from the how-to business model as manager, of the book on ministry, or the crisis model. We are now in an acute predicament that we have to solve right now. It is not, therefore, this book based on problems or techniques, in also Reverend Winter's words. Two other key terms that I really like are the portability of ministry that she talks about, and that comes back in all the different chapters, and the emphasis on testimonies as the stuff that I think narrative theology is made from. I cannot go into the details of the whole book, but believe me, it offers an unbelievable and therein compellingly credible tapestry. But I want to end with two questions and maybe a further comment. One is the Habakkuk quote on page 16 of the preface that follows, where she says, where she talks about the tapestry or the stories that we have to tell. I'll read the quote. Then the Lord answered me and said, write the vision, make it plain on tablets, so that a runner may read it. For there's still a vision for the appointed time. It speaks of the end and does not lie. If it seems to tarry, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. Write the vision. If the multiplicity is connected in a vision, what is that vision? Can it be articulated aside from just giving impressions of the multiplicity in a more unitive way, or does that detract from the multiplicity? Does that have another sort of subversive effect? But if it can, in what direction do you see that vision tend? What is the goal, the integrative goal toward which the arc of ministerial practice is ultimately being bent? That's one question. The second question is that if it is true on page 15, preceding the Habakkuk quote, that all our testimonies are needed in a world that is dying for good news, and ain't that the truth? But also, if this is not a problem or crisis book, how do we pinpoint what we need, and how do we go forward on a path of ministry and of multiplicity that remains laced with diverse testimonies, but that still is somehow also charting a course, keeping pastors somehow together, even if we know that they're all on their own way? Okay, that was my second question. And finally, a concluding comment. I was thinking of parallels as I was reading Cynthia's book, and I had two kind of parallels that came to mind. One is, you all know, and in the Div School you'll certainly read Hadot, Philosophy as a Way of Life. I think this is ministry as a way of life. And I think there are good claims to write a book on ministry as a way of life. So I just say that also because I think there can be a tendency to kind of see somehow ministerial studies as somehow into epistemologically on a lower plane than, say, an abstract philosophy, and I think that's wrong. It's different, but there shouldn't be that sort of hierarchical vehemence given to it. So that's why I wanted to put ministry as a way of life there. But another, maybe more pertinent parallel is with a book written by Mary McClintock Fulkerson called Places of Redemption, Theology for a Worldly Church. And it's a very interesting book in which McClintock Fulkerson talks sort of about her own religious community and various people in it, and uses them as lenses to go very deep into theological questions on evil and Derrida and various, theorists come up. So it's really a great book that sort of combines practice and theory. And so my final question would be, where do you see this go? What kind of theological connections do you see in terms of narratival theology? And do you see any connection with McClintock Fulkerson that you could say work a companion? Actually, I thought it would be great to have a course on, say, your book and McClintock Fulkerson book, and maybe get a few more to kind of get a good discussion on this going. So I'm just curious as to where you see this go for the follow-up. Thank you.
It's 10 after. No, that's great. That means less airtime for me. Thank you. Thank you to Dean Rosengarten, who set me out many years ago on this journey that I never intended. In some ways, this book is trying to figure out how did this happen? How did I get here? There's a little bit of that in there. Thank you, Christian, for noting that there is in this book some consolation when we set out to do things that we don't know how to do and didn't know we prepared for. That is exactly, that's a piece of this, that's true. Thank you to Willemien for her collegial work with the students in preaching and worship, with your Emersonian catalog that I was saying, yes, that's a part of this. Thank you to all of you. There are people in this room who represent all different parts of the conversation that I've been having for many, many years. From people in leadership, Jim, it's really nice to see you here, to people in my therapeutic community. Jim has been always an interlocutor for me. There are students here whose profiles appear in little bits in this book. I have to say that a lot of this book was written trying to understand and educate in that real sense of the word education, to educate the fullness you bring, not to smush it into some inauthentic, constrained, retro version of me or someone else. So I really appreciate all the ways that all of you have contributed to this conversation. I'm grateful for that. Let me just say a couple things about what was challenging about writing this, because I think it elucidates some of the things that you both were asking. Then I'll get hopefully to both of your questions really quickly, and then I want to open it up because I'm curious about what you are all thinking while we are all talking. As I did this work longer, as I sat in this very research-oriented, academically rigorous place, and tried to prepare persons for lives in accompanying people from all different walks of life in all different places to make meaning in their own lives. The thing that came back to me over and over again is what relational work theology is, what relational work meaning-making is, what relational work ministry is, and that relation goes all the way down. That relation is self to self, That relation is self to others, that relation is self to community, self to historical moment, and self to that ongoing process of sort of ultimate meaning making. This is relational work. It requires conversation. Those of you who've been in class with me will not be surprised to hear me say, this is conversation. And by conversation, I don't mean the filling up of space with words, but I mean the creative exchange that makes things happen, that creates things, that brings things to be. That's what I think ministry is. That's honestly what I think good scholarship is. So in some ways, it feels very comfortable to talk about this book in this place. That's not hard for me at all. I've long ago forgotten if I should have known that ministry is an odd thing to talk about in this space. If that's true, I've forgotten about it. To me, the same processes that create good ministry, good practice, careful, ethical, religious leadership, those are also the practices of good scholarship. If that's not true, I've long since ago forgotten it. The difficulty, honestly, was trying to say all of this in a way that people who don't live in this space might identify themselves and might take something. I do think it's a challenge that we have to be able to articulate something real about the lives of real people in a way that those people can hear and participate in the creation of meaning. Not me telling them, this is what you are, this is what you do, or this is what you should do, but my listening to them and they're telling me and themselves, this is the fullness of what I do. I think scholarship has a way to go if we're going to be generally socially useful in helping people to participate with us in that creative conversation. That was what I tried to do here. My mother wrote to me after she started reading this, and she said, I was with you until chapter 2. I'm not sure. This may be that I didn't accomplish what I set out to accomplish. But that has been the challenge, and actually that has been the excitement of doing this work, and something that I'd encourage all of you to think about doing. What are the ways in which legitimately places like this and conversations that we have here, how do we engage persons in all manners of life in this conversation in a way that retains their dignity, their autonomy, and articulates their wisdom? To be honest, this is a work for me in practical wisdom. It's one of those things that you will say about a good practitioner. I know it when I see it. I know that I know that person's doing good work. I don't know why. I wanted to know why. I wondered the same thing about my washing machine and my car. So I'm that kind of person who's always trying to figure out, like, why does that work? Why does that work? This was a book to try to figure out, why does that work? I appreciate the questions. Let me get to the questions. I appreciate the questions that Christian raised about, does it have to be multiplicity? Like, what does that bring to the table? My editor said the same thing. When I said this title, and it had multiplicity in the title, she sent back a note to me and she said, no. We can't talk about multiplicity because people in the culture don't understand it, and they think by it you mean what? Pardon?
Schizophrenic.
Right, some people say, well, that means schizophrenia. Right? Other people say that means duplicity. Right? So we either have some kind of moral failure or we have some sort of psychological stress. That made me lean into it all the more. Right? Because it comes to me that something that is as essential as the way that we experience ourselves in the world, variously, but that very variousness is both morally suspect, right, and seen to be somehow non-normative. That worries me a great deal. It worries me a great deal because I think that a lot of the injuries of religion come from that kind of lack of multiple-mindedness. right? The kind of rigidity of dogmatic forms that oppresses people and destroys faith. On one hand, and the sort of fragmentation, disillusion on the other hand. I chose multiple-mindedness and stuck with it because I think it is of the essence of what it means to be human, and also of the essence of what it means to conduct oneself in society. If we cannot hold together our own multiplicity, I think we cannot receive the differences in the other in a way that's constructive. And so, if I'm hearing you right, that's why I stuck with the notion of multiplicity, because I think it's critical to the conversation. And because I think we're always afraid of it. We always would like to say, I've reached an integration and this is it. The teller talks about this dialectic, right? The self-identity or the self that's already always been kind of shifted and changed and augmented. This is a dialectic, and I think both of you kind of related to it in different ways. It isn't a this or a that. It's a this and then a that, and a this and then that. It's a movement back and forth, back and forth. I resonate with what you said, Christian, about the perils of narrative inquiry and narrative interviewing. I do think there are some limitations there, and that there are ways that there are stories abroad in the culture and people know how to speak in them, right? I agree with you. What doesn't come out so well in the text, I think, is that the narrative interviewing style is not one of a solid narrative and somebody dumps it on you, but it's an interaction. It's a questioning and response, and so you're building something, and that something changes over time. But it's the way that I know to help people engage their various experiences and to recognize them. Because in most places in their lives, they don't have those interactions. At least this is true for pastors. In most places, they don't have these interactions. People do not ask them about themselves. And oftentimes, they don't feel free to say. Okay, that's why I get bombarded on airplanes. By passengers. So I think the narrative model is important because of its possibility of self-discovery, not just reproducing some kind of cultural narrative that's coming out there. I think multiplicity is important because we resist it. I think that's probably saying. And if you were asking about Mary Fulkerson's work. Absolutely. I mean, I read her before and I've read her afterwards. I think there's some huge resonances. When I talk about this book in churches, members of congregations come up to me and they say, this isn't a book about pastors, it's a book about us. Right? It's a book about people, it's a book about congregations, and it's a book about the way that we talk together in communities. And so they're eager for this. I've been asked to come and interview congregations about the same, in these same sorts of ways. So no, it's not a book just about pastors. I do think it's a book about religious life, broadly conceived. And that where it's going, if I had to say, is a reclaiming of a complex notion of humanity and creation that is constantly constrained in this world by accommodating the kinds of forces that would limit a variety of expressions. Those are political, those are economic, those are social. I think religion, and it's doing what religion does, is constantly reinvigorating complexifying. So that's what it's called. We're late.
Not that late.
Questions?
Floor is open for questions. How's that?
Thank you.
Thank you. Floor is open for comments and questions.
I'm curious how doing this work for the book changed your approach in the classroom and to the program that could have only happened through the work in the book. What the
You probably, you know the answer to that question very nicely. Let me say a couple of things. I time ago because there was a prompt and it said you could have money if you do this research, and I said, okay, how do I do this? The prompt limited what I could do, and I need to say that up front. I would not have written a book only about Christian pastors, except for the fact that the prompt in the research was for studying Christian pastors. At the very end of this book, as I wrote through it, it became really clear to me that where the future of this is going is that Christian pastors can't exist only as Christianity. Christianity needs its sister traditions. Christianity can't exist in a bubble by itself. And in fact, it never was. It never did. So where I have gone with this in my own mind is what you guys are experiencing in the classrooms, which we're working hard at not having an only Christian conversation. And the ability to encounter, as you know, in our multi-religious working group, the ability to begin to have a conversation that doesn't rely on just a single set of images, stories, assumptions, ways of conceiving reality. That's what this work did for me. It also did a lot of big work in explaining me to me, which I think just makes you more comfortable in the classroom, right? There is a way in which I realize in a classroom what I can do and what my limitations are, because I did this work. But I think the openness to multi-religious conversation, of education, information, and how critical that is for this time, that can be this.
Thank you. This has been really fun. I come from a leadership perspective, and I have a lot of talks about leadership, and pastors are seen as leaders. One of the things that Harry Davis in the Booth School talks about, and puts a slide up on, is are leaders a peach with a core, a hard core that is their soul, or something that is so, them, and there's this other stuff around it, or are they onions with all these layers? And which one do you see, the peach or the onion? And I guess I'd just be curious to hear your thoughts. Is it both the peach and the onion, and how can it be that? And if you want to get down to the core of being a leader, is it about having lots of layers, or is it about having something that grounds you, that motivates you to do the work that you are called to do?
That's so interesting. See, both of those things to me feel limiting because they have skins on them, right? And I think whatever this is, the qualities of leadership that I think are critical require that ability to go out from there. So whatever, I don't know what kind of, I don't think it would, the fruit or the vegetable, what the postmoderns talk about the rhizomes, or maybe it's a rhizome. I think it can't be self-contained, right? That there's a core there, but the core is a process, the core is moving, the core is adapting. You talked about adaptability. I don't think it's just about adaptation. The thing that you call courage, I think. Did you talk about courage? Yeah. To me, that is how one engages the other and the outside. Creativity comes from the same place. Winnicott, my favorite psychoanalyst, talks about the third space, the transitional space, as out here, not just in here, where things can come across the skin. So I would say it's kind of opening whatever we're doing. Does that make sense? Yeah.
We're going to think about that a little because, given the structure of our roles, I felt compelled to raise some methodological questions. But in general, I'm delighted about the book, and the UChicago book, it seemed to bring a lot of the really wonderful work that was done during the 60s and 70s, especially, to work. And part of that is this ineluctably social nature of the self. Right? So it was a person who goes models, peach, and onion, and everything. Well, those are inappropriate because it's a multiple dynamic. And so one that cells are social, right? They're social products. They're not individual artifacts. But if that's the case, then wouldn't it follow in some sense that a pastor or a minister can only be as good as their congregation, or to put it another way, congregations get the ministers they deserve. But you see the point that I'm making.
They see the point you're making.
So much so. I mean, that's what, tangential viewpoint, but similar. When you listen to some pastors talk, not these pastors in this book, when you listen to some pastors talk, they will talk about their congregation, my congregation, right? That's a construction. What they mean by that is the congregation that allows me to be this thing that I am, right? So in some ways, you're exactly right. My push for multiplicity is, I think that that's a very flat and narrow way of conceiving about the role, either of the congregation or of the pastor, right? And I think one of the reasons that I was interested in what a well-lived pastoral life looks like is that that's the complaint as a therapist of pastors that I get all the time, right? That these people with their very unitary expectations of some kind of stereotypical religious leader, no kidding, people in the grocery store in the line to buy a lottery ticket used to hide when they saw me coming in my pastoral role because they would say things like, well, did you have to eat too when you're at the store? The way in which these stereotypical roles limit, flatten, constrain, depress, and sometimes traumatize the people on either side of the spectrum, the congregation plain words. So I wrote about this multiplicity in part to get past that, to move past that. Pastor of a congregation that doesn't acknowledge a community and live in a historical moment in the world, in a large college, is meaningless. So, multiplicity.
Yeah, you're saying it's wonderful that this is actually getting legs as a useful manual for congregations as well. Because obviously, because of that dialectic, you can't just educate pastors to multiplicity, you need to educate congregations to multiplicity.
Entirely.
So I think we are about at the time to adjourn, but we cannot leave. Don't move a muscle, especially your pectorals, without saying thank you to Cynthia Gano Lindner.